is the definition of a hyperinflation. Well, if we look at some of these inflations that have actually occurred, and not so long ago, we get to give you some figures here. 1989 and 1990, Argentina. Remember, the definition of hyperinflation is 50% per month. Argentina in 89, 197% per month. Okay. Armenia in 1993, 438% per month. Bolivia in 84, 120%. France, if we go by a historical example, France at the revolutionary time, 143%. Germany, Weimar inflation, 29,500%. Hungary in 1945, 1.295 times 10 to the 16th. You know what kind of a number that is? It's 129 followed by 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 15 zeros. 129 followed by 15 zeros. Nicaragua, 1986, 126%. Peru, 114%. Poland, 1989, only 77%, but it's still hyperinflation. Zimbabwe, 231 million %. I mean, that just happened the other day, right? In the news not so long ago. All right, so we're talking about examples that have occurred from the French situation, 1789, all the way through 2009 with Zimbabwe. And every one of these was the result of a government treasury or a central banking system of some kind emitting new amounts of paper currency, although the modern ones, they were probably doing a lot of it electronically. The consequence of all of these events is, of course, a tremendous amount of social destabilization. Right? The economy collapses and society begins to go into some kind of moral free fall because it's catch as catch can, people trying to protect themselves as much as possible against the consequences of economic collapse. So these events are not only of economic consequence, they don't only have an economic side, but they have what, to use the terminology that Washington, D.C. likes to use, they have a homeland security consequence to them. They lead to fantastic levels of destabilization, not only economic, but social, and then political. If you take the example of Weimar Germany, 1923 Germany, and just to show you how fast this went, in June of 23, an egg cost about 80,000 marks. That's because the country had had a great deal of inflation during World War I and then subsequently from 1918 to 1923. So they already were on the inflationary path. But in June of 23, an egg cost approximately 80,000 marks. By the end of November, they were talking in the terms of trillions of marks per an egg, and then of course the entire system collapsed in the first week of December. So in 6 months, it was destroyed. Now, Germany was not what you would call a backward third world country in 1923. It had one of the most sophisticated populations. You talk about culture, science, art. I mean, Germany was at the top of the heap. But they made the mistake of going down this economic pathway, which led to political instability. And within 10 years, because during that period from 23 to 1933, the totalitarian parties came out of the woodwork. There was the Nazi Party, the Communist Party, various radical socialist parties. By 1933, one of those totalitarian parties had in fact won an election and achieved legitimate political power. That was the Nazi Party, and followed on within 6 years, 1939, Second World War breaks out, 75 million people are killed, Europe is destroyed, ends up in the control of Stalin and the Russian communists. China ends up in control of Mao Zedong and the Chinese communists, and you draw the consequences from that event. Well, there's no economic historian or political historian will look at that situation and say that the hyperinflation of Weimar Germany did not have a significant and direct causative effect on the rise of totalitarianism and ultimately Hitler and then everything that followed from it. So we have some very serious consequences potentially facing this country if we were to go into a hyperinflationary event. Now, this same conference I attended on Wednesday, that was the question. Given this level of debt, what is the likelihood, because you can't really calculate probabilities here, this is a unique instance, what is the likelihood of having a hyperinflationary event here in the United States? And the conclusion was that it is more or less certain. Because once the government budget reaches the point where 40% of its total is financed through debt, in every instance but one in recent times, there has been a hyperinflationary event. All right, so that's that side of the coin. That's the economic side of the coin. Now we look at the Homeland Security side of the coin. Imagine yourself in Washington. I can imagine myself in Washington. I can imagine myself in Washington many years ago, looking at this monetary and banking system and knowing that it is inherently, has always been, inherently unstable. Remember, the Federal Reserve came in 1913. The promise was that by setting up this national banking cartel, there would be what economists then called a lender of last resort that would provide the necessary liquidity to stabilize the banking system. And scientific management would take over, and all depressions and inflations and so forth would disappear. Everything would go along on a very steady path. That was the promise in 1913. Well, immediately they had the war, and then the first depression under the Federal Reserve System actually occurred in 1920 and 21. There was an immediate post-war depression, right? But it was a small one. 1 year and 18 months it was gone. Then they had the big one in 32, 33. So let's forget the little one. From 1913 to 1933, 20 years. Scientific management under this system failed within 20 years. Now, did they wake up at that time and say, we've made a mistake? We need to reevaluate what we're doing here? No. And it's interesting, the Federal Reserve System had a 40% gold requirement, 40% gold reserve requirement for the notes that were issued through the Federal Reserve banks. That wasn't sufficient to stabilize it. But did they say, well, we need to have even more of a reserve? We need to control this more stringently? No. They took the gold away from the American people. Roosevelt seized the gold in 1933-34. Said it was illegal to own gold. They outlawed the ability of Americans to make so-called gold cause contracts, that is, contracts payable in gold. They gave the Federal Reserve System even more power. They created a thing called the Federal Open Market Committee, which gave it more power to intervene in the debt market. Now, they're able to get away with that because there was a depression not only in the United States but worldwide. And this country was, for all intents and purposes, in the best economic position. In fact, if we hadn't had Roosevelt, we would have been in a very good economic position. But because of our circumstances, economic circumstances, we were in the best economic position to weather that, and there was a great deal of political instability, especially in Europe. So gold actually flowed into the United States because of all of that. And with World War II, we were the only country that didn't suffer any significant destruction in the course of the war. All of our industries employed massive numbers of people, became the arsenal of democracy, to use Roosevelt's phrase. More gold flowed in, especially from Britain, to pay its war debts. Fascinating. The British Empire was destroyed paying its war debts to the United States. So when this country ended, when World War II ended, this country had the largest stock of gold in the world, perhaps the largest stock of gold that had ever been seen in the world. The Federal Reserve and the government, not so much in the 50s, but certainly in the 60s, began an easy money policy in order to finance expanded governmental social programs. Remember, we had the war on the one hand, the Vietnamese War, and the Great Society. And Lyndon Johnson's theory was you could have bread, you could have guns and butter. That was the phrase, guns and butter. Right? And the Federal Reserve was there to provide the ability for the government to expand spending through monetization of debt. And in the course of that period from 1953 to 1971, they did that so well that foreigners asked for redemption of Federal Reserve notes in gold, took out over 50% of the U.S. gold stock. So in 1971, President Nixon came along and said, we have to stop this, and he essentially repudiated that debt.